Deep in the Montana Territory archives sits a leather-bound journal that hid one of America's darkest family secrets for more than a century. Forest rangers stumbled upon it in 1943 while clearing an old trapping route, and inside they found 847 pages of daily entries written in 3 distinct hands, but all tied to the same family. What those pages reveal about the winter of 1867 in the remote Bitterroot Mountains shakes every idea we have about survival sanity and the human capacity for darkness. When authorities first read the journal, they locked it away, stamping it too disturbing for the public, and for decades the truth about the Wainwright family never saw daylight. Before diving into Barnabas Wainwright's story and that of his 3 daughters, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because this is exactly the kind of hidden history we uncover, and drop a comment with the state you're listening from. This isn't just a Montana story. It's the kind of nightmare that could have unfolded in any frozen corner of America during those brutal frontier winters. The journals forced investigators to rethink every missing person case from the 1860s. Because what happened in that cabin was not simply tragedy. It was a record of how isolation and grief can turn a devoted family man into something unrecognizable. Barnabas Wainwright had built his name as one of the toughest fur traders between Fort Benton and the Canadian border. At 42, he was known for surviving where others failed, a man who understood the wilderness and the harsh balance it demanded. His trading post on Beaver Creek was a lifeline for trappers, prospectors, and passing soldiers, and his family stood as the picture of frontier success. Barnabas had married Catherine Bellwether, daughter of a Methodist minister from St. Louis in 1851. She braved the wilderness with him, mastering survival skills and raising their daughters in a home where education was as important as food and firewood. Margaret, the eldest, at 26, had a near photographic memory and served as the family's meticulous record keeper. Elizabeth, 24, was a gifted seamstress and healer, tending frostbitten trappers and wounded travelers. Sarah, just 21, had an uncanny sense for weather and animal behavior that often kept the family safe. The Wainwright trading post stood in a natural clearing by Beaver Creek, its log cabin built to withstand winters that trapped families for months. Outbuildings stored meat and supplies, and a guest cabin sheltered passing traders. By 1867, the Wainwrights were wealthy by frontier standards, holding trapping rights, trade agreements with native tribes, and promising mining claims. Their name carried weight from Fort Benton to Helena, with even military leaders seeking Barnabas's counsel on wilderness conditions. Catherine Wainwright had always kept close ties with her family back in St. Louis, and her letters from the summer of 1867 painted a picture of happiness and prosperity. She wrote proudly of Margaret's engagement to a wealthy merchant in Helena, of Elizabeth's growing reputation as a healer respected by the local native tribes, and of Sarah's remarkable drawings of mountain wildlife that visitors eagerly commissioned. Though isolated for much of the year, the Wainwrights relied on one another for company education and emotional support. Winter evenings were spent around the stone fireplace, Catherine reading books sent from the East, the daughters busy with their projects, and Barnabas sharing stories of his travels or planning trade routes. For more than 15 years, this rhythm of work, study, and mutual care had carried the family through the harsh demands of Montana's wilderness. To neighbors scattered across the territory, the Wainwrights were proof that refinement and stability could thrive, even in the remotest parts of the West. But on October 15th, 1867, everything changed. Old-timers would later call it the worst winter Montana had ever seen. The first blizzard struck without warning, sweeping down from the Canadian peaks with a force that stunned even the most seasoned frontiersmen. That morning, Catherine had gone to the creek to wash bedding before the freeze set in. As she crossed the narrow log bridge, the storm winds knocked her into the icy water below. In her journal, Margaret described hearing her mother's screams through the roar of the storm. She and her sisters rushed outside, struggling through the blinding snow, until they found Catherine pinned beneath the collapsed bridge, her legs trapped by heavy timbers in the freezing current. It took all of them, Barnabas and his daughters together, to pull her free. But by then she had been immersed for nearly an hour. Barnabas carried her home, and they stripped away her frozen clothing, trying every remedy they knew to bring warmth back to her body. For 3 days, Catherine drifted between fever and delirium. Elizabeth's entries from those nights record the growing panic as pneumonia set in, and with the nearest doctor more than 80 miles away and the trails already buried in snow, there was no hope of help. Catherine's breathing grew shallow, her mind slipping back to childhood memories of Missouri, and in rare lucid moments, she failed to recognize her husband and daughters. On October 18th, she died quietly in her sleep. Barnabas was shattered. In 16 years of marriage, he had never spent a night apart from his wife. He refused to leave her side for nearly 12 hours, unable to let go, as his daughters pleaded with him to begin the grim preparations. The earth outside was frozen solid, making burial impossible. Following frontier custom, the family had no choice but to preserve Catherine's body in the smokehouse until spring. A grim reality that would cast its shadow over every day of the long, merciless winter ahead. Margaret wrote of the strange, dreamlike moment when she and her sisters carried their mother's body, wrapped in their finest quilts, to the storage shed, where it would remain frozen for 6 long months. Yet the greater weight wasn't the act itself, but what began to happen to Barnabas in the days that followed. According to Sarah's notes, their father abandoned the bedroom he had shared with Catherine and instead planted himself each night in the main room, staring silently at the chair where she had always sat. He stopped shaving, stopped bathing, let his beard grow wild, and soon looked nothing like the proud trader he once was. The first cracks in his mind showed on October 25th, when he began holding long conversations with that empty chair, speaking of trade decisions, family matters, and household chores, as if Catherine were still answering him. At first the daughters dismissed it as grief, certain that, with time, he would return to himself. But by early November, the illusion had grown darker. Barnabas began setting Catherine's place at the dinner table, serving her meals that went untouched while the girls sat in tense silence. When Margaret quietly suggested ending the ritual, Barnabas exploded with rage, accusing her of dishonoring her mother and vowing to ban her from meals if she spoke that way again. With the roads already buried in snow and their nearest neighbors nearly 30 miles away, the girls had no one to turn to, no voice of reason to pull their father back from the edge. Elizabeth recorded her fears in her journal, writing that their father seemed to be vanishing into a world where mother still lives and where we are becoming strangers to him. She described finding him in furious arguments with Catherine's chair, his tone rising and falling as if answering words only he could hear. By Thanksgiving, the family was sealed inside their cabin. Snow pressed against the windows like white walls. The wind screamed endlessly outside, and wolf packs howled in the distance, creeping closer each night. Inside the home that had once run with order and purpose unraveled. Meals became erratic, sometimes skipped for days, sometimes turned into lavish feasts in Catherine's honor. The daughters lived in constant fear, never knowing what would ignite Barnabas's temper. But the most horrifying change came when he carried all of Catherine's belongings, her clothes, her jewelry, every keepsake into the main room, arranging them neatly around her chair, as though she might walk in and reclaim them. And then, in what Margaret described as the most chilling act of all, Barnabas cut Catherine's hair before she was laid to rest in the smokehouse. Each day, he sat by the chair, brushing those long strands, speaking to them, as if his wife could still hear every word. Sarah's journal gives the clearest window into how quickly their father's mind unraveled. She described waking one night to find Barnabas sitting naked in front of the fire, speaking softly to the empty air about his courtship with Catherine, their wedding night, and other private moments no daughter should ever hear. When Sarah tried to place a blanket over his shoulders, he shoved her aside, shouting that she had interrupted an important conversation with her mother. By December, his grief had twisted into something far more sinister. He no longer spoke to his daughters as children, but treated them as trespassers, intruding on his life with Catherine. He accused them of stealing her attention, raging that their mother had been too distracted by their needs to give herself fully to him. In those moments, his eyes grew glassy and wild, his voice shifting without warning from tearful pleading to guttural threats. For the daughters, the isolation became unbearable. Not only were they trapped by snowdrifts sealing the cabin, they were also trapped with a man whose mind no longer recognized them. Elizabeth wrote of the fear that came with each new day, never knowing if they would face the broken widower who wept for his wife or the hostile stranger who resented their very presence. Supplies dwindled rapidly as Barnabas veered between refusing food altogether and gorging himself during imagined feasts with Catherine. They discovered he was secretly discarding smoked meat, insisting Catherine had told him it was spoiled, and when confronted, he accused his daughters of plotting to poison him and his wife. He began hiding food in secret caches around the cabin, places only he knew. Outside, the wolves gathered. Drawn by the scent of meat and the smell of fear, the pack swelled to more than 30 strong, larger than any Sarah had ever seen. Each night, their howls crept closer, weaving an eerie chorus around the cabin as though mocking the family's decline. Margaret's entry from December 15th marks the moment everything changed. She wrote that Barnabas spoke to Catherine's chair for 3 hours, then turned to his daughters with a look she had never seen before. It was not the look of a father seeing his children, she wrote. It was the look of a man seeing something else entirely. That day, he asked Elizabeth to brush her hair like her mother once had. When she did, his stare lingered with disturbing intensity. Then he demanded Sarah wear Catherine's blue anniversary dress. When she refused, Barnabas flew into a rage, smashing dishes and screaming that she was insulting her mother's memory. But the tone of his anger suggested something darker, that he no longer saw Sarah as his daughter at all. Elizabeth's medical knowledge told her he was suffering from what physicians of the era might call brain fever, severe emotional collapse, brought on by grief, exhaustion, and isolation. But naming the illness did nothing to protect them from the man it had twisted. The sisters began sleeping in shifts, always keeping watch. That vigilance soon revealed that Barnabas was leaving the cabin at night barefoot or half-dressed to sit for hours inside the smokehouse with Catherine's frozen body. Each time he returned, his behavior grew more disturbing. Sarah's entry from December 20th is perhaps the most chilling. She followed him to the smokehouse and listened as he spoke tenderly to their mother, confessing his loneliness, how empty their bed felt without her, how much he longed for her touch. But then his voice shifted. He began speaking about his daughters, Margaret, Elizabeth, and Sarah themselves, saying they moved like her, that they looked like her, that in the dim light he could almost mistake them for her. Christmas Day, 1867, marked the turning point in the Wainwright family's nightmare. Margaret's journal for that morning begins with a chilling detail. Barnabas woke his daughters before dawn and insisted they dress in their mother's clothing for Christmas breakfast. At the table, he had set 5 places instead of 4. And when Margaret questioned the extra setting, he looked at her in bewilderment and said, "For your mother, of course. She'll be joining us soon." The strain of constant watchfulness was beginning to fracture the sisters. Elizabeth wrote of crippling headaches and dizzy spells from the pressure of managing her father's chaos while trying to keep their home intact. Sarah's sketches had taken on a disturbing edge, wolves with human eyes, shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. Then on December 28th, Margaret uncovered letters hidden beneath Barnabas's mattress. They were written to Catherine, but inside were confessions of his attraction to his daughters. He described them in explicit terms, insisting that God had sent them to ease his grief, that Catherine's spirit had told him it was right to seek comfort in their arms. Margaret wrote of her horror reading these words. Elizabeth, drawing on her limited medical training, searched their books for answers and found accounts of nervous disorders where grief and isolation shattered the mind, erasing boundaries of morality and reality. But knowing the diagnosis was no shield against the danger in their cabin. On January 2nd, Sarah recorded the first direct assault. Barnabas cornered Elizabeth in the pantry and tried to kiss her, murmuring that she looked beautiful in Catherine's apron. When she shoved him away, he erupted in fury, accusing her of cruelty and claiming she had failed her duty as a woman of the house. For the sisters, the truth was undeniable. Their father was no longer grieving. He was becoming a threat. Margaret's journals described their whispered strategies for survival, how to protect themselves without provoking more violence. Outside, the wolves closed in. Sarah's careful notes showed the pack had swelled to over 30. Their behavior more coordinated, their daylight appearances more brazen, as though they were stalking the family outright. At night, their howls turned into strange, layered calls, a sound Margaret likened to voices conspiring outside the walls. Inside, food dwindled. Barnabas's erratic eating habits and paranoia pushed the family to the brink. He discarded provisions, hoarded meat in secret, and refused to eat food prepared by his daughters, insisting only Catherine could be trusted to cook for him. Elizabeth calculated their remaining supplies might last 6 weeks at best, but only under normal use, which was no longer possible. By January 8th, Margaret's entries reveal their desperation. They debated trying to reach the Henderson homestead despite the blizzards and the wolves. Elizabeth believed she could make the trek, but Sarah's small frame and Margaret's lack of wilderness skill made escape almost suicidal. Worse still, Barnabas had begun sabotaging their gear, removing snowshoes, hiding winter clothing, ensuring the daughters could not leave. When confronted, he feigned ignorance, but his intent was clear. Elizabeth wrote with chilling clarity, "I believe Father knows at least dimly that his feelings toward us are wrong. But instead of resisting them, he has chosen to keep us here trapped in his madness." The most disturbing revelation came when Sarah uncovered another set of letters, not written to Catherine, but to each of her daughters. Hidden in the smokehouse, where Barnabas spent his nightly vigils, these pages revealed a mind completely severed from reason. In them, he detailed his romantic obsession with each girl, as though they were strangers he intended to court and marry. He described their physical traits, their personalities, even their potential as wives with the same detached precision he once used to evaluate trade goods. Most horrifying of all, he claimed Catherine herself had given her blessing to these plans, speaking to him during his visits to her frozen body. By mid-January, the sisters realized that their survival depended not only on enduring the brutal winter, but on navigating the increasingly dangerous presence of their father. The man they had trusted all their lives was gone. In his place stood a stranger, driven by obsession and convinced that God had chosen his daughters to replace his wife. Then came the storm of January 18th, 1868, remembered as the worst blizzard in Montana's recorded history. For the Wainwright sisters, it was more than weather. It was a death sentence. Escape was no longer possible. Margaret's journal that day contains one chilling line. "The storm has made escape impossible, and Father announced at breakfast that God has answered his prayers by ensuring his new wives cannot leave him." Elizabeth's observations provide a stark medical portrait of Barnabas's collapse. He had stopped sleeping altogether, his nights consumed by fevered conversations with Catherine's empty chair, and disturbing attempts to force affection on his daughters. His appearance was ghastly, hair-matted eyes sunken, his body wasted to the point that he resembled more beast than man. When the sisters discovered what he had been preparing, the terror inside the cabin became unbearable. Sarah described finding silver rings crudely fashioned from melted coins, along with handwritten marriage certificates that Barnabas had signed on Catherine's behalf, declaring his intention to wed each daughter in separate ceremonies. Margaret recorded her horror on January 22nd. Father cornered me in the storage room today and showed me the ring he made for our wedding. When I told him fathers cannot marry daughters, he screamed that I was not his daughter anymore. I was a woman in his house, eating his food, and therefore obligated to provide what mother had taken with her death. His eyes no longer held any recognition of who I am, only hunger. Elizabeth soon discovered schedules he had drawn up with the precision of his old trading ledgers, assigning days for romantic meals, private conversations, and physical duties with each of them. The cold, businesslike nature of these notes made them even more terrifying than if they had been written in passion. Meanwhile, Sarah documented it all in sketches that captured the grotesque transformation of their home. A trading post turned prison, a cabin turned into a twisted chapel where their father planned to marry his own daughters under the approving gaze of their dead mother's belongings. The most disturbing image to survive in Sarah's sketches shows Barnabas's bedroom transformed into a grotesque shrine. He had stolen items from his daughters, ribbons, dresses, hairbrushes, and arranged them beside Catherine's keepsakes, fusing the memory of his dead wife with his fantasies about his living children. Outside, the wolves had grown bolder than ever. Elizabeth's notes describe coordinated attacks, with some wolves distracting, while others tested the walls and door frames as though they understood the structure of the cabin. Any hope of escape, even in rare breaks between storms, had vanished. Inside food had reached crisis levels. Yet Barnabas turned scarcity into another weapon. Margaret recorded how he began withholding meals from any daughter who resisted his advances, sneering that wives who failed in their duties did not deserve to eat. Starvation became his chosen method of control, proof that despite his madness, his cruelty was deliberate and calculating. Then came the night of January 28th. Elizabeth awoke to find her father standing naked over her bed, one of his handmade wedding rings in his hand. Sarah's journal recalls the screams, the frantic rush to help, and the sight of Barnabas in a state of arousal, muttering prayers about consummating God's will as he tried to force the ring onto Elizabeth's finger. The sisters barely managed to restrain him, but the encounter left them shaken beyond repair. That night, Elizabeth wrote, "We can no longer pretend. Father is gone. In his place is a predator, and we are his prey." From then on, every attempt to reason with him only provoked violence. Margaret discovered sharpened kitchen knives hidden around the cabin, weapons stashed in places that suggested tactical planning. His military background had resurfaced, lending him a predator's patience and strategy. Sarah's journal captures the shift with chilling clarity. "When Father looks at us now, I see no trace of love. Only the gaze of a man calculating his conquests. He believes Mother's death released him from all law and morality. To him we are compensation for his loss. Worst of all, he cannot comprehend why we resist, as if our terror is just another obstacle to be worn down by force." By early February, the sisters understood their reality. They were no longer waiting for spring, no longer hoping for recovery. Survival now meant defending themselves against their own father. They slept in shifts, barricaded the doors, and hid makeshift weapons in every corner of the cabin. But deep down, each of them knew the truth. These defenses were only temporary, against a man who knew their weaknesses, who had the strength to overpower them and the cunning to exploit their love for him. No barricade could hold forever. February 14th, 1868. Valentine's Day marked the peak of Barnabas Wainwright's madness and the beginning of the ordeal that Montana families would whisper about for generations. Margaret's journal for that morning opens with a single line, as chilling as anything written on the frontier. Father announced that today was the perfect day for his wedding to Sarah, and that Elizabeth and I would serve as witnesses to God's blessing on their union. When Sarah refused to wear Catherine's preserved wedding dress, carefully altered to her smaller frame, Barnabas snapped. He struck her so hard she slammed against the fireplace, a sash splitting her forehead that scarred her for life. What followed was no longer grief. It was war. Elizabeth, desperate to protect her sister, struck Barnabas with a heavy iron skillet, buying them precious seconds. But his strength and military discipline made him nearly unstoppable. Margaret described the fight as a battle against something no longer human. He came at them with guttural sounds instead of words, eyes burning with hunger. The sisters fought with kitchen tools, iron pokers, anything they could reach. Furniture shattered, windows broke, and the cabin was soon painted with blood. Sarah's sketches later captured the scene the Wainwright home turned into a battlefield. Catherine's belongings scattered like relics of a family now destroyed. Elizabeth's wrist was broken. In the struggle, Margaret's shoulders slashed open by a knife wielded with frightening precision. Sarah, the youngest, used her agility and knowledge of her father's patterns to stay ahead of him, darting through the wreckage like prey, trying to outsmart its predator. The turning point came when Margaret realized the only weapon left was his obsession. She screamed that Catherine's spirit disapproved, that their mother was furious with his sins. For a brief instant, Barnabas faltered, staring at Catherine's empty chair as though ashamed. Sarah wrote, "Sias." Something flickered in his eyes, a flash of the man he had once been. But then he hardened and said words that will haunt me forever. "Catherine is dead, and you killed her by being born. Now you'll replace her or you'll join her." When reason failed, Barnabas turned to brute force, systematically trying to overpower each of his daughters. Elizabeth recorded the moment with chilling detachment, her words stripped of emotion, as if distance was the only way to survive. The fight nearly ended when Margaret seized an oil lamp and threatened to burn the cabin down around them all. The threat made Barnabas hesitate, but he saw through it. He knew his daughters would never destroy their only shelter in the Montana winter. What followed was a stalemate that lasted 6 hours. The sisters barricaded themselves in the storage room, while Barnabas alternated between begging for their compliance and promising violence if they continued to resist. In that cramped space, Elizabeth tended Margaret's wound and bound Sarah's cut forehead, while the sisters whispered about their dwindling options. For the first time, they understood there might be only 2 paths left: kill their father or die by his hand. By February, the sisters understood there were only 3 choices: remain trapped until spring and endure their father's assault's attempt escape into the blizzard and certain death, or find a way to end the threat he had become. Sarah's journal captured the decision with brutal honesty. "We realized the man outside our door was no longer our father. He was a predator. The father we loved died with mother. What remains would destroy us if we allowed it to live." Margaret's final entry for February 14th was a single devastating line. "Tonight we learned that survival sometimes requires choices that destroy the survivors as completely as death." When rangers stumbled upon the Wainwright cabin in April 1943, they found one of the most chilling crime scenes in Montana's history. The building had partially collapsed, but inside lay the desiccated bodies of 3 women, surrounded by journals, letters, and drawings that documented a slow descent into madness. A 4th body, a man, was found in the smokehouse, placed beside the preserved remains of a woman identified as Catherine Wainwright. Dr. William Hartley, the territorial coroner, concluded that the 3 daughters died of starvation and exposure in the final weeks of winter. Their bones bore signs of healed fractures and defensive wounds, evidence of the violent confrontations described in their journals. The male body told a different story. Barnabas Wainwright had been killed by a single precise wound to the heart. The angle and depth suggested medical knowledge and ruled out accident or suicide. Elizabeth's final journal entry dated February 15th revealed the truth. Father is finally at peace, reunited with mother in the smokehouse. We could not let him go on living in madness, nor could we survive another day as his captives. Margaret held him, while Sarah and I did what had to be done. He looked surprised, but also relieved, as if he finally understood. She added that they wrapped him in Catherine's quilt and laid him beside her, fulfilling in death the union he had longed for in life. But their own survival was already slipping away. Food was gone. The wolves had grown bold, pressing against the walls with terrifying persistence. Margaret could barely walk. Sarah burned with fever, and Elizabeth admitted her own strength was fading. Her words closed with grim resolve. We will not become like Father. We will not let desperation turn us into monsters. The final pages of the journals are fragmented, shaky handwriting shared among the three sisters. Their last entries are marked by an eerie calm, as though they had made peace with their fate. Sarah's final gift was a series of haunting sketches of the wolf pack surrounding their cabin, dozens of animals working in eerie coordination, their eyes fixed on the house as though they sensed the dying family inside. Margaret's last act was one of calculation. She tallied the number of days since Catherine's death, the shifts in temperature, and even the estimated size of the pack. Her final entry, dated March 8, 1868, was simple. Today marks 143 days since Mother's death. We have decided that 144 will be enough. When investigators searched the cabin, they uncovered still more disturbing evidence, over 60 letters hidden in corners and beneath floorboards, written by Barnabas in his final weeks. Addressed to women both real and imagined, the letters revealed a mind lost in obsession, weaving delusion into prayer and lust into scripture. The Wainwright journals remain one of the darkest records of life on the American frontier. A family once seen as a model of survival and refinement collapsed into madness, violence, and despair. And yet within those pages, the daughters left behind something more enduring testimony of their courage, their refusal to surrender their humanity, and their final act of choosing death on their own terms, rather than becoming prey to the man who had once been their protector. Some letters were addressed to Catherine, others to his daughters, and several to women whose identities could never be confirmed. Together they revealed the mind of a man who had fully severed ties with reality, constructing elaborate fantasies and moral justifications for behavior that exposed his total collapse. Hartley's psychological report concluded that Barnabas had suffered what modern psychiatry would recognize as a complete psychotic break, triggered by grief isolation and the relentless stress of survival in the wilderness. Hartley noted that similar cases were not unheard of in the territory's harsh winters, and isolation had driven even strong moral settlers into madness that turned them against their own families. The territorial marshal's investigation centered on whether the daughters' killing of their father constituted a crime. Yet the overwhelming evidence of threats, violence, and attempted assaults convinced officials that Barnabas's death was justifiable homicide, a necessary act in defense of life and dignity. The case was quietly closed. No charges were filed. Officially, this was out of respect for the victims. Unofficially, territorial leaders feared the scandal that such a story might unleash. What happened next reveals the depth of that fear. Forest Service records show that the Wainwright cabin was deliberately erased from maps, its remains buried under obscuring brush. The bodies were placed in unmarked graves at a secret site, and all physical evidence was sealed in archives that remain restricted, even now. The stated reason was protection of the family's reputation, but internal memos suggest something else. Officials worried about the psychological effect that such a detailed case of domestic collapse might have on other isolated settlers. The Wainwright tragedy directly influenced territorial policy. Authorities established new emergency supply caches along remote routes and required traders and families in frontier outposts to maintain contact during winter months. Policies meant to prevent other families from enduring the same fate. When investigators sought local native accounts, tribal elders spoke of strange wolf behavior during that winter. Packs gathered in unnatural numbers moved with eerie coordination and hunted in ways that defied tradition. They also described hearing voices on the wind, human screams and cries carried across the mountains. For the tribes, these were spirits of the broken family. For investigators, they were the echoes of the Wainwrights' final months of torment. The journals themselves became invaluable to early psychologists, medical professionals, and historians who studied them as rare documentation of madness under frontier conditions. But excess was tightly restricted. Their explicit accounts of incestuous desire and violence were deemed too disturbing for the public. Later forensic study only deepened the horror. Handwriting experts confirmed that several of Barnabas's later letters had not been written by him at all, but by Elizabeth, forced to transcribe her father's dictated fantasies as part of his psychological torture. Meteorological records confirmed what the journals described. The winter of 1867-68 was the harshest in Montana's history, with temperatures plunging to 40 below zero and snow piling 12 feet deep. No one, no matter how skilled, could have escaped that natural prison. Sarah's sketches of wolf packs, once thought the products of fevered imagination, have since drawn the attention of wildlife biologists. Her drawings depict predator organization far beyond anything previously recorded. Wolves moving with uncanny intelligence, their behavior shaped by the same extreme pressures that destroyed the family trapped inside the cabin. In the end, the Wainwright journals remain more than a record of one family's downfall. They are a portrait of how grief, isolation, and environment can dismantle the human mind, turning a father into a monster, daughters into reluctant executioners, and a home into a tomb that haunted Montana for generations. The claim that more than 30 wolves surrounded the cabin suggests that even nature itself conspired against the Wainwright family, driving normally solitary predators into coordinated packs that made leaving the cabin a death sentence. Over the years, the case has appeared in studies of frontier psychology, domestic violence, and survival under extreme isolation. Yet the details remain hidden from the public, locked away in classified files, whispered about in academic circles, and pieced together only from the fragments that survived. Attempts to find the original cabin have failed. Forest Service records admit the site was deliberately obscured, and time has erased most physical traces. Hikers sometimes report finding scattered artifacts and bones, but none have ever been confirmed. Even the wolves left their own mystery behind. After the winter of 1867-68, their numbers in the Bitterroot collapsed, and tribal accounts claimed the massive pack either dispersed or perished in the snow. Today, modern wolf populations avoid the area near the suspected cabin site, refusing to establish dens where everything else suggests they should. The Wainwright story is a reminder of how thin the line is between civilization and collapse. The frontier demanded more than skill, it demanded unbreakable resilience of the mind. And even the strongest could falter. So, what do you think? Was the whole truth revealed in those journals, or do secrets still lie buried in the Montana mountains? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more horror stories from America's hidden past, hit that subscribe button, tap the bell, and share this story with someone who loves dark mysteries. The frontier still holds many secrets, and we'll be here to uncover them all. Until next time.